Hi, welcome to this week's Mailbox, and most of the comments this week, of course, will be based largely on the video I did about whether or not Legion was a success. So effectively, a lot of them are your own views on whether or not it was a success and to what extent it was, but also a little bit of competition news as well. So first of all, let's just get on to today's Mailbox. So last week's Mailbox, basically the last few weeks, I was getting like one person getting it right. So I thought, come on, wake up. So I gave you a very easy one. Thankfully, it was very easy. Lots of people knew where this was. Well done. Let's see if you can try a little bit harder for this one. We'll go back to, not super obscure. I'm not going to make it super obscure, but this week's is there. So if you can tell me where specifically it is, like which location it's in, and which zone it's in as well. So that's this week's Mailbox. So on to other proper competition news. So the competition that I started about a month ago has almost come to an end now. So it was basically finding 4 clues in videos, which are really obvious clues. Actually, someone's based their answer on what they thought was a clue. It wasn't a clue at all. The clues were super obvious. There was nothing subtle about it. And you've just got to say what person or place or event links the 4 clues. And a lot of people have already been putting their responses in. The deadline for that will be Monday the 16th of July, which is tomorrow as I do this. But specifically by 4 p.m. UK time. So check where you are in relation to that. Because then what I do is I go through the videos where I said I would look for the answers, and I compile a list ready for Tuesday's Azeroth review, where at the start of that video we will randomly generate the winner from the correct responses. I've still to decide how it is. There is a tool actually I can do which should look quite good. However, I was thinking I might actually do an in-game roll. As it is World of Warcraft, and obviously put that on there as well. But that'll be for Tuesday's Azeroth review, where we'll announce the winners for there with further instructions from there. And I'll do it right at the start, so for people who don't normally watch the Azeroth review, whether live or on the recording, you only have to watch the first few minutes to see if you've won. Obviously, I'll try and message you if I can as well. So, shall we get on to this week's responses? So the first one is to do with stat squishers. So someone not particularly happy about the stat squish. I'm ecstatic about it. It says, but I really wish Blizz wouldn't waste so much time with stat squishers. I'd be happy with them simply adding numeric representation. For instance, 150k, 150 M, B. B, really? You don't mean G? T, blah, blah, blah. There are other, prefixes after T. But anyway, yeah, okay, so I know what you mean. Blizzard at one point did say that themselves, They said, well, we could just keep putting these like prefix letters after them, after the numbers, and it shouldn't be a big deal. But then they've changed their mind on that. I think a lot of people weren't particularly happy. I think the player base in general would prefer just having the squish, because numbers at a certain point just do get a bit silly, even if you just, talk about so many significant figures and just add a power of 10 at the end of it. Another problem, I suppose, is also the system's being able to keep pace with it. Now, there was an upgrade after MOP, because there was a problem in Mr. Pandaria that the numbers got so big that in the last fight of Mr. Pandaria, the raid fight, which was Garrosh, his health had to reset I think it was twice, wasn't it? It had to reset twice. And that wasn't part of the design of the fight as such. The reason his health had to keep resetting was because the health that boss needed for the appropriate level of difficulty wasn't possible with the game as it was then. There have been upgrades to the infrastructure since, so it can now cope with bigger numbers. But I imagine there's still a limit. I don't understand how these things work under the bonnet, or under the hood if you must insist. But yeah, there is a limit with the systems as well. I don't think it can just keep going on forever either. But for whatever reason, whether Blizzard did go with the stat squish again because the player base en masse sort of preferred that system, or whether it is because they don't want to run into a situation where it can't cope again, or it causes other problems that I don't know about, I don't know. But yeah, we wouldn't have to do AAAB or anything like that. There are prefixes that go on quite some distance. There are quite large numbers in science, so we do have the prefixes for them. So this person not particularly happy by the looks of it. It says, no, Legion and WoD will forever be the worst expansions in my book. Got bored of Legion multiple times over its period due to lack of content outside Mythic Plus and Raiding. Which I found a little bit interesting. Obviously, if you get new content, if you don't want to do that new content, you don't consider it content. But if I think about it, I don't really think that there has been any other expansion that's had more content. Because in actual fact, the raiding, you know, because that surprised me about the raiding and Mythic Plus, because the raiding didn't really get any, it got what you'd expect. You know, with each major content patch, you got a raid. So, but the raiding has always been fine. You know, we've always got new and decent raids. The Mythic Plus, I mean, that's almost self-generating. There were obviously new dungeons added through there, and that meant, of course, new Mythic Plus opportunities, I suppose. But everything else was... I can't really think of an expansion where there was more and more varied regular content. Because what did we have? We had... there was the micro holiday, so I can understand if you're not interested in those. I'm not interested in those. So, but it's still content, but you might go, well, I'm not interested in that content. Then there's the Trial of Style, which again, you know, isn't there all the time. There's the Mage Tower. You know, we had the Chromie thing. We had new zones open up with new quest lines in each one as well. You know, the Broken Shore first of all, and then Argus. So, and obviously when we got to level cap, you had a whole zone that could only be accessed once you got to level cap in terms of doing the quests. So, with the army training and all the rest of it. I can't, you know, I'm not sure. Again, I can only come to the conclusion that this person didn't like that content. But then I'm thinking, well, what was there in previous expansions? Because if you're saying it's the worst expansion, you're saying that there was content in previous expansions that came that was better. And I'm struggling to think what it would be. I can appreciate that the scenarios that came in MOP, maybe they like the scenarios, so that would be maybe one thing. But then the Mage Tower was like sort of scenarios. But for single player. You could argue the Argent Tournament for Wrath of the Lich King. But was that really more interesting? Maybe it is for some more interesting than... And Molten Front in Cataclysm. Maybe that's the sort of thing they preferred. But to me, those were just areas of dailies, which I wasn't playing actually when they both came out because I'd quit WoW early on in Wrath, so I wasn't there for the Argent Tournament being current. And I didn't come back till very late Cataclysm, so after the Molten Front was already done and dusted. But to me, they just look like areas of dailies where they might be interesting to begin with and then would quickly wear out. So I don't know. But, you know, this is one of those subjective things, isn't it, when it comes to content? It's like what one person, like, as a raider, for example, WoD didn't have a lack of content for me because, well, it had the raids. But for someone else, of course, it had a lack of content. If you weren't into your raids, there was nothing else. So I understand that if it's stuff that you don't want to do, but I wish the person would have said what they thought was better in other expansions, because I can't think of anything. If you don't think it's enough, that's one thing, but to think that another expansion did it better, it's like, which and how? So again, no one wasn't too happy. It says, no, too much grind. I felt the grind. You know, some people have talked about, you know, World of Warcraft, oh, so much grind. And in years past, I'd have gone, what are you talking about? Because I've never had to grind in World of Warcraft, even as a raider. Never really felt the need to grind. I did in Legion. It says, too much RNG. Again, I've talked about that. I think it's the type of RNG. And there is another type of RNG they're throwing into the mix as well in BFA, for which I need to do a video. Preferably tomorrow. It says they screwed over several 100,000 people with that Mage Tower. Did they? In what way did they? I wish... Can people explain themselves? Because I'm not sure what they mean by this. I don't know how it screwed people over. Because, like, you know... Is it because it wasn't easy enough? Because people wanted the skin, but it wasn't face roll, so they couldn't get it. But they can, because they can get it now. It's relatively easy now, I gather. I mean, I don't know, but I imagine it is. And also, all of these challenges you can learn. You can just watch a guide. I've had no end of people look at my guide and go, oh yeah, I've struggled, but now I've watched this and I've done it this way and I've done it. It got increasingly easier as you geared up. But you might mean something else. You might mean that the Mage Tower screwed us over in some other way. I don't know. But I don't really see the Mage Tower. This is the first time I've ever heard anyone say anything negative about the Mage Tower. A lot of people quite liked it and are a little bit reticent that we probably won't get the equivalent in BFA because, Blizzard have said when they do these things, they're creating content for like a small part of the population. And even though that was really their plan in Legion, I think they've decided now it takes too many resources. They don't want to do it for BFA. So I don't think we're really getting anything like that for BFA. Anyway, on to the next one. It says, not to mention screwed over their own art department, creating all the art that will soon be wasted. But it won't be wasted. Because, well, in other expansions, it was wasted. No one had an issue with this before Transmog came along because the same thing was happening. The art team would create new art. Sometimes it would just do recolours of previous art. Still does that. And that really was wasted. But then Transmog came along, gave it a new lease of life. The same thing's happening in BFA. It's not gone to waste because you can still use those skins. You can transmog it onto your weapon in BFA. I'm not sure if this person doesn't know that or again means something else. But, the grind certainly was there and for the first expansion ever, I felt it. And the RNG, as I say, the type of RNG. The RNG that doesn't even itself out for a player, which is the big problem. I think RNG is an essential part of a game like this, but it needs to be stuff that evens itself out. Like I say, if you've got tier gear was a classic example. So you might have someone in your raid who gets their 4 set in the first week of a new raid coming out. So they're lucky bastards. But a few weeks later, so will you. Right? They were lucky because they got it early. You'll get it in a few weeks. So it evens itself out. After a month, generally speaking, I mean, I've been particularly unlucky in Legion with getting it. But by and large, people have got their 4 set after about 4 weeks. Whereas the legendaries, when it was super important, especially at the start of the expansion, some like my spec only had 2 3-put legendaries. There were a couple of others that were decent, but only 2 3-put ones. And it had such a big effect on your output that it's like, must get these. But the RNG there was not only in terms of when you got them, but which ones you got. And it wasn't this sort of luck that evened itself out. There were some people who got their 2 bis legendaries in a few weeks, ready for raiding pretty much, and then there were others who didn't get even their first 4 weeks, and there were some who didn't get their bis ones at all for for that whole raid tier, or that least raid, that first raid, Emerald Nightmare say. So that's going through the whole thing, and that could colour their view of how well they can perform in terms of raids at that time. So that sort of RNG, yeah. And the fact that I was hoping Blizzard would have learnt from that for BFA, but they haven't, because they've removed some of it, because that was where the hope was. They're getting rid of the legendary thing. They recognise that people didn't like that, but they seem to have fundamentally misunderstood what people didn't like about it. And as a result, that element of RNG is still in BFA. Maybe, to begin with, at least not as bad, because we don't have that legendary thing. Same here. It seems to me that a majority of people think having more added content equals success of an expansion. 11 weeks and people are bored and start complaining. Why not make the content harder to complete? I know the answer to that doesn't mean it's right. The thing is, though, when you say make the content harder to complete, I'm going to go out on a limb and suggest that after those 11 weeks, very few people had completed all of the raid content at mythic level. So there is very difficult content in there for people. And the people who had completed it in 11 weeks are generally not the sort of people who complain that the game's too easy either. You don't hear Method complain that the game's too easy. You know, they beat the stuff quite quickly and then they're just working up towards the next one. But they don't complain it's too easy, because they know that they have to put in like a military type effort to be able to beat it as quickly as they do. So again, I just wonder if this is one of these situations where someone's saying, well, because you've got your casual content. Your casual content can't be that bad. But in terms of the challenging content, you've got raid. For PvE, I'm not going to talk about PvP. Obviously, PvP has the innate challenge of against other players. So PvE, you've got raids. Again, very few people are completing all of the mythic raids, which means, because it's a bit like I'm not accusing this person of being like that, but you do often see on the forums someone complaining that raids are too easy, for example. And you'll look them up, and they won't have done any mythic bosses at all. They certainly haven't completed all the mythic bosses. And it's like, what are you talking about? Or they'll say the game's too easy, or the class is too easy. And again, they haven't completed the harder content. It's like, well, how do you know the class is easy when you've never tested yourself against the difficult content? You know, because any monkey can, you know, press buttons in any random order and do LFR, which is all some of these people have actually done when you look them up. But yeah, so in terms of, you've got the raiding, you've got the Mythic Plus dungeons where you can't, you know, you keep pushing that. And then the Mage Tower, again, a lot of people, I was coming on the previous comment, there was a lot of people took a long time to complete the Mage Tower. So there was challenging content in there, both solo, small group, and large group, you know, Mage Tower, dungeons, Mythic Plus dungeons, and raids. So for the various types, there was challenging content in there. So there's no other type of content they need to make harder. Obviously, you shouldn't make questing any harder, because it's not as accessible. And people talk about, you know, how difficult some of the questing was in vanilla. It wasn't that difficult. It was just that you had some areas where you had elites in it, all right? Some people would have had an easier job soloing those than others, but you didn't need, the idea was to group with those anyway. And in fact, if that's the sort of thing you like, then you'll be quite pleased to know. In most expansions, if I came across a quest that says, oh, we recommend you take about 3 players for this, my response to that would be, bollocks, I'm just going to solo it. Well, in VFA, I ain't soloing them. No way, Jose. You know, some of those they were to begin with when I was first trying them out in Alpha. I was going, oh yeah, Paladin, easy, no problem. Now, in fact, when you look at some of those world quests and they've got a dragon around them, meaning elite, it means it. It might just be one mob. You ain't doing it on your own. Well, I'm not doing it on my own anyway. I've managed to do it. So yeah, so if that's the sort of thing you like, well, you're in luck. But by and large, it can't be that hard, because then it's not very fair on other people who don't really know how to play. Right, okay, on to the next one. So this person, more positive one. Let's have some more positive ones. So it says best or second best expansion of WoW. They don't say which they thought was their best, but they thought it was at least best or second best. Revitalize the game's lessening population and popularity. Depends what they mean by that as to whether or not I would sort of agree or disagree. If they mean literally revitalising the lessening population, I think I would agree. Because in WoD, because remember, you can almost split the player base into 2 camps. There's the ones which will include raiders who subscribe every month because there's always stuff for them to do. Even now, you know, we're still doing stuff, so we're still subscribed. We don't suddenly go off for a couple of months. So those ones, Blizzard didn't really need to do. You know, a lot of the systems they put in, like the artifact power system, stuff like that, didn't need to be in. But then there were those who subscribe when there's new stuff out, do it for a month or 2, and then don't subscribe until there's going to be something new out. And that's why Blizzard started doing things like, you know, time gating the release of LFR wings, and bringing in the artifact power system and stuff like that, and the world quest with emissary. It's to let us feel that there's something we should be doing every few days at least, and definitely every week, or we'll fall behind in power. So even though there was some catch up, it was just easier to do it do the content continually. Now, from the point of view of that, in WoD, there wasn't a lot of times when you'd expect someone could literally just resubscribe for 1 month every 6 months, and they could do everything. In Legion, that wouldn't have been possible, so you could argue it might have got some of those people to resubscribe for a bit longer or more often. So if that's what you mean, it may be true. In terms of it actually raising the population higher again, because obviously we know it's been declining, but to raise it back up again, we won't be able to say yay or nay on that at all. There are certain things in terms of what populations do that increase. Like, we know, for example, that there are more people raiding, mythic raiding including, than there was in WoD. We can sort of tell that from data collection. What we can't tell is the number of players subscribing to the game at any time. Blizzard no longer tell us, and we can't really tell. Because if we look at it and we go, okay, well, there's way more people, getting to level cap now, looking at achievements. Well, is that because there's more players and it's still rough? Because there's plenty of people that play the game that never really get to level cap, as baffling as that seems. Blizzard have said themselves that there's quite a large number do that. So, if there's more people getting level cap, that could be that there's more people playing the game and it's the same proportion of people that get to level cap and don't. Or it could just be that more of the people that play get to level cap. Or it could just be that more of the people that get to level cap get multiple characters to level cap. Although I strongly suspect that's not true compared to WoD. Because in WoD, leveling up, and that's all there was to do. So I certainly was, but I suspect most people were more likely to have more alts in WoD than in Legion. Although I did see a comment of someone saying the opposite. But I think that might be in the minority. But that's just me thinking. I don't know. That's the problem. We have no real way of telling. You can't really tell if the population has increased or not, the number of subscribers at any one time. And Blizzard don't share that information. In terms of popularity, though, I think the people who've subscribed would probably consider it more popular. So in general, I would say in terms of the revitalising, I would definitely agree. I think a lot of people do consider it's revitalised it. It could, but again, it couldn't really fail compared to WoD. So maybe we compare it to MOP. Has it done so compared to MOP? That I don't know, because MOP, I thought was also excellent. And personally, I preferred MOP, but that's me. That's just me. Next one. So it says, I at first thought the Azerite only dropped from cash. So the idea that you can only get Azerite gear from your weekly cash as opposed to Mythic Plus dungeons doing them is a con. But your argument made me rethink. I forget the point that you need a key for that dungeon, and maybe there's a week you just can't find a group for that dungeon you want to go to. With the actual system, you can just do any Mythic Plus and can still get the piece you want. So this was about, I was trying to explain, because some people were saying, well, which is valid, by the way, because Blizzard made the point of saying you will be able to farm for the specific Azerite gear you want. Because one big problem with legendaries is you weren't able to farm it. It was just complete. All you could do was content that gave you a legendary and, hope you got the one you wanted. So they made a big show of saying, but it's not random which traits appear on them. They drop in certain dungeons and raids and stuff like that. So you can target those dungeons. But you can't really. Because although in normal and heroic they'll drop, and in Mythic Plus 0 I think they do as well. In Mythic Plus, actual proper Mythic Plus, they don't. They only drop in the weekly cash. And it's good that happens, because what I was saying is, the problem is, like, if your BSP, say, drops in the Motherlode, that's one of the dungeons, but you don't get a key to it, and you don't find anyone else who's got a key at the appropriate level, then that means you can't target it that week. Or maybe you find one group, okay, it means you get one shot at it, but you don't get any other shots. So that, so whichever way you look at it, you're not able to farm it. But it will encourage you to stay on for longer and look for groups that have got that key and try and get into those groups, which is shitty, which is a bit shit. So what they've done is say, well, it drops from the cache. Now, the downside to that is, of course, then all of a sudden it stops you being able to target it. So although you say you can just do any Mythic Plus and still get the piece you want, you can, but it's like what drops in that cache is stuff from all the dungeons. So it's almost like forking over your currency to the vendor that gives you the upgrade gear in Legion and hoping for your Arcano Crystal, but getting any number of another 24 trinkets that you could also get. So it's not, it almost makes it sound what Blizzard was saying about being able to target it has not been quite true. But that being said, the system they've put in, I think, is better than the alternative. Certainly it is for me, because you were otherwise relying on luck in terms of being able to get the keys you want. And also, I say luck, there was also an issue about certain classes as well. Like some classes would be able to do that more easily than others. There are some classes, let's face it, that are always just more appealing for a Mythic Plus, particularly a pug group, than for others. So it says, saying Azerite armor replaces artifact traits is ludicrous. Well, Blizzard said that. It says, we will be cycling through several sets of Azerite armor, unlike the one set of artifact traits read at the entire expansion of Legion. It's absolutely replacing tier sets, despite your focus on the number of items in a tier set of gear. Think about it, you get 3 unique, rotation changing, potentially effects with Azerite, blah, 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 blah. Thing is, it's not what Blizzard said. Blizzard did not say it was replacing tier. In fact, the reason why some people thought we'd be having Azerite gear and tier is because Blizzard didn't say that. They said it's the artifact system. That's what it's replacing. And it is the same, because where this came from is I was trying to explain, some people are moaning about the fact that some of the Azerite traits just buff an ability. Well, so did our artifact traits. That's what they were for. You've got to understand what the artifact system exists for. The artifact system is not a gameplay tool. It's not something in to enhance gameplay. That's not its purpose. Its purpose is for those aforementioned people who will subscribe to for a month, and then unsubscribe until the next content patch. It's to keep them subscribed for a bit longer. Because that's what the artifact system does. It encourages you to farm continually to raise the power of your character. In previous expansions, when you got to level cap, you had your spells, they were done. There was one period in vanilla, late vanilla, mid to late vanilla, in AQ, where you could get from Anchorage things that boosted certain abilities as well, like spell books that bunged your abilities up by another rank. But by and large, whatever you've got to level cap with, those are your abilities set. The way you build the strength of your character by then was just purely in terms of getting more gear. But the problem with that is that people aren't actually that motivated by it, especially if for doing the content they need to do. And there's always catch-up gear as well. So they put in the artifact system to emphasize to people the stuff you should be doing every day. If every week you don't do something like this, you're going to fall behind others. And and even though there's a catch-up with artifact power, it's that psychology of you're going to fall behind if you stop playing for a bit. So they want people to be playing. And then if you're thinking to yourself, wow, there's stuff I need to be doing every week, you're not going to think of unsubscribing. So that's all it exists for. That, pure and simple. And the reason why we have these traits, and we had them on our artifacts in Legion, and we've got them on our artifacts in BFA as well, and that just passively buff something, is because they want us in our not playing every week to be in a weakened state. But Blizzard themselves said it's a direct replacement for the artifacts. That's what they said. They also linked it to the legendary system as well, because the legendary system was announced at BlizzCon that was going to, and they said some of the utility of the legendaries. So that's why it's like the artifact. It's a combination of really the artifact and legendaries. Nothing to do with tier. The tier has just been replaced because it's not needed. But they didn't link it to tier gear at all at BlizzCon. So yeah. But you can have the view that in your mind you see it as that, but that's not what it was designed for. Class, but now this is the big one. I almost didn't put this one on. You made it a bit long. You didn't need to make it this long. But I'm not going to criticise, because some people say that I go on for too long about certain things as well. If it was a line longer, it would have cut off the top of my head and it wasn't going to go there. I shall read it. So I'll read the whole thing and then I'll try and pick it apart bit by bit. It says, I will say you're actually extremely wrong in terms of the class design argument regarding mitigation and damage. So much so that I'll say that doing that would wind up making the game worse in the long term. I wrote a giant thing which you probably won't read, so I'll just say this. I would have read it, but I wouldn't put it up here if it was any longer. Giving all specs the same mitigation ability, let's just say 70% less damage for 3 seconds, for example, is flat out lazy and ultimately hurts the game and is actually bad gameplay. If you're bad, you'll whine that your class or spec can't soak X ability, but this is a team game and a lot of times there's things other people can do to help out. If you're the only one dying to something, you can get an external Bart skin or paint sup, whatever the case might be, to help soak it. There is actually almost no case where a decent group won't be able to make it through something because of a certain comp with a certain spec, because decent players work together and use their abilities to their fullest. But with that said, more importantly than that, if the fights are designed well, there should be other methods or mechanics in place that will be what's important for dealing with the damage. The fights are what need mechanics in place to handle large amounts of damage, especially if it's bursty. If there's an ability a boss deals that will one-shot the group, there should be something in place, whether it's an interrupt or a buff you have to get from killing a mob or losing the boss, whatever the case might be. But the fight itself should have something to mitigate that damage, not a spec. You're going about it all wrong, and that's what's been plaguing Blizzard for so many years. They've been going down this road, catering to casuals that don't understand mechanics, that don't know how to play their class or spec, so they keep homogenizing specs, and it's not helping the game any. When what they need to be doing is making the actual encounters better, because ultimately what's going to happen, especially now with no... you go on. Sorry. With no gear swaps, a spec is going to get to a point where it literally just cannot progress further if it wants to be effective during the dungeon. Your mindset is literally what Blizzard is doing with Mythic Plus in BFA. Your spec might not be able to compete at 10 key because your gear can't handle being good at AoE, single target, and also for soaking. So you're going to be behind. So what's Blizzard going to do? They said they would balance around that. But how would they do it? They could nerf the boss's damage, but they wouldn't really do anything. It's just a band-aid. Sure, you might be able to do a 10 key, but you won't be able to do an 11 or 12. So then what do? Well, let's just make all specs have the same mitigation. That's completely balanced. Everyone can progress equally. But then it's just boring and terrible gameplay. So let's start one at a time. So the first one doesn't really say anything. So we'll go on to the next one. It says, if you're bad, you'll whine that your class or spec can't soak X ability. But this is a team game, and lots of times there are other things that people can do to help out. If you're the only one dying to something, you can get an external. No, if you're the only one dying to it, you won't get an external. Externals are for tanks, okay? What will happen is they'll go, oh, well, this person has the abilities to soak it or to deal with that damage. We'll take them instead. You're on the bench. That's what they'll do. And then the next point says, there is actually almost no case where a decent group won't be able to make it through something because of a certain comp. Now there, you are objectively wrong. Method, who's going to say that, they have a better raid group than, say, Method or Exhaustus or Limit, Scrub Busters, these sort of people? All of those raid groups take the composition that will allow them to beat that fight. They do not just take their 20 best players on whatever they happen to play. Ever. They never, ever do that. They decide what is the best comp, and then they will say, right, who's going to play this, who's going to play... That's how they do it. That's the only players in Method who always play the same class are the ones who play the classes that are always going to be strong in every fight, because there are some of those. So that point is objectively wrong. The best raid teams in the world sculpt their composition based on the encounter, not based on what they've got, because they will have whatever they need. Their Method, their Exhaustus, their Limit, their Scrub Busters. Sorry if I'm missing out any others that are at that level, but those are the 4 main ones for me. It says, because decent players work together and use their abilities to their fullest. Yes, of course they do. All Mythic Raiders do that. But their fullest, if it's not good enough, they'll get someone in. Or even if it's just about. Like, for example, take Coven. In the guild I did it, we did Coven with, as a number of guilds would have done it, with a lot of melee. Okay? It was doable. We eventually did it. but it took us a lot longer to kill it than if we'd have had fewer melee and a load of warlocks and shadow priests. If we'd have had a load of warlocks and shadow priests, that fight would have been killed more quickly. And that's just all there is to it. So that is objectively wrong, because you cannot point to the established best raid teams in the world and say, well, they do it like that, because they don't. They get the composition they want. If they want 5 warlocks on a fight, they will take 5 warlocks on a fight. We sort of know this from Tuma Sargeras, don't we? Where certain guilds took, what was it, 4 blood DKs on Mistress Sazine on the first week, until Blizzard, went, hey, what's going on here, and changed it. Because those guilds are not they're not adapting, they're not going, oh, well, your class is struggling a bit, we'll help you out, we'll hold your hand. No. It's like, we need 4 blood DKs for this. All right, we'll take 4 blood DKs. So, sorry, that one is objective. There's no opinion about that. It's objectively wrong. Your next opinion seems to be that rather than building it into the specs, Blizzard should build it into the encounters. So, for example, and I know where you're coming from with this, so what if I think is how I understand it, what you say, you're still chopping the top of my head off. This is not good. Just make it a little bit smaller. I've read it through anyway. There we go. So what you seem to be saying is a little bit like, I suppose, an old arcade game, isn't it? So if a particular fight needs you to soak something, that a mechanic happens just before that time. Maybe some ads come in, you kill the ads and it drops an orb, and you pick the orb up and it gives you an absorb shield, which will allow you to soak the thing. I think that's probably what you're talking about in terms of encounters. And sure, that would be fine. I agree, that would totally solve the problem. But they don't do that. Now, whether they should do that or not, that is subjective, that is a matter of opinion. But the fact of the matter is that they don't do that. And I'm not saying they never do fights like that, but they don't habitually do that. And because they don't habitually do that, then that means either the specs, which you seem to be suggesting, have become more homogenized. The reverse is true. They have not. They've become less. But regardless of that, your options, given that Blizzard don't do that, that's not how they design their fights, is either you give all classes the ability to deal with it, or some players cannot be in on a fight even if they happen to be the best player in that group, unless they have an alt that does have it, which is what some people do. You don't even have to be in the top 10. Some people even in the top 200, top 600 even, quite frankly. Some players will be so frustrated with this that they will play multiple characters, at least a second character, just to be able to bring it along. I mean, if I was totally set on not being on the bench, stuff like that, I would do the same, because I'm a Retribution Paladin. I would just make a rogue or a warlock or something and keep it leveled up, keep it geared up, sorry. But the role-playing aspect of it is very important to me. This is the role I choose to play. If the game doesn't allow me to play it, I'm not going to moan, not going to bleat about it. I'll just say, okay, it doesn't allow me to play it. End of story. I'll go and find something else to play, which is what I've been talking about recently. But yeah, so Blizzard don't do that. You can argue that they could. I'm not going to disagree with that, but they don't. So, now that brings me on to last sort of couple-ish one here. So I started my rambling series, which the first one was about 20 minutes. The second one, which I did yesterday, but it's not going to be on, Friday, sorry. It's not going to be on YouTube until next Friday. So only patrons are seeing it at the moment. It's taken about 35 minutes. They're not going to be in equal lumps. But yeah, I was going to do it as one video originally. It was going to be huge, so no. But yeah, I was talking about the benefits of Mythic Raiding, which have always been, fairly stable, and the drawbacks of Mythic Raiding, which has sort of gone up and down at various times. And at the moment, all I'm saying is, obviously, with anything like that, if the drawbacks equal or exceed the benefits, then it's not worth doing, and you decide it's not worth doing. Sometimes you persist a little bit because you think, well, maybe the benefit will increase or the drawback will reduce. Especially with something like Mythic Raiding, you can't quit it 1 week and pick it back up a few weeks later. You have to find a new guild and all the rest of it. And worse still, you can't pick it up easily 6 months later because then you're hopelessly behind in gear and experience. So you then have got to do some more catch up on your own. So, you know, sometimes if it gets super close, you think, well, I'll just try and weather the storm and see if it, you know, rebalances. And if it doesn't, then you think it's not worth it. So what I'm saying is at the moment, the benefit is ahead of the drawbacks. But not by much. It wouldn't take much. And so saying here, I had suspicion for a while, and I think I know how this might end. I don't know how it would end. It's one of these things, you know, I might announce next week that I'm going to stop Mythic Raiding. I'm not going to stop WoW. I'm not going to stop World of Warcraft. But I might stop Mythic Raiding. And I might decide next week that that's what I'm going to do. But it might be that we're 2 years down the line, and I've been Mythic Raiding all of BFA, and I'm having the same conversation thinking, but will it be worth it in, I don't know, Revenge of the Potato People? Something like that. Don't know. But I'll just to give you a highlight of a couple of things that could do it. So in terms of drawbacks, something that could, because it's so close, anything could tip it over the edge. So here's a scenario. In BFA, we're going to obviously need to farm artifact power. It stands to reason, you know, especially the raid artifact gear is going to need the most artifact levels on our neck to be able to access those traits. So we're going to have to farm more artifact power. So that means doing a few islands a week at least, as well as the other source of artifact power. So I also, because mythic caches, the weekly caches, give you up to three pieces, even though getting 3 pieces is rare, but 1 or 2, but up to 3 pieces of raid mythic quality gear in terms of item level. The equivalent of mythic raid quality gear. So you can't really, if you do a +10, you can't really pass that up. So that means you need to, as well as all your raiding and as well as everything else you can do solo, which can be done casually, you can fit it in whenever, that's fine. But in terms of stuff for which you still need a group, but it's not scheduled group stuff, you need to be able to do some islands, and you need to be able to do some, and you want to do the mythic islands, if you're a mythic raid, I'm guessing. And you want to do some mythic plus dungeons, again, pushing those keys to at least a +10. So, let's say I go, okay, well, you know, if I'm able, let's say doing all that would take about 3 hours. I'm just guessing. Let's say it would take 3 hours. But let's say in order to be able to do those islands and those dungeons, I had to be online all Friday evening and pretty much all of Saturday to be able to be around when those groups are going to form. That might mean that I need to be online for basically 15 hours just to do that 3 hours of content. So that means 12 hours, not completely wasted, because some of that time I can be doing the solo stuff, but not 12 hours worth. So that means that I am going to be having to, you know, not do other things on Friday night, not do other things on Saturday, because I need to be online, even if I can be doing other things whilst not actually in game, but still being able to see the screen or check Discord or wherever these things might be discussed. So if it's going to take me 15 hours to do that 3 hours of content, that's the sort of thing that could push the drawbacks too high. Just as an example. With the benefits, it could well be that the benefits come down. The drawbacks may not be as bad as I fear. It might be that at the end of a raid, there's always loads of people wanting to do these things, and I can get myself into groups every week after a raid or before a raid easy. No problem at all, and there's no issue. And I don't have to reassign my Fridays and Saturdays. Great. But let's say I get into the raids, and there's a few raid fights where, you know, my particular specs, lack of utility or something is not great, and I get left out of key fights. Not necessarily the pissy little fights that are going to take 2 or 3 pulls. No one really cares too much about them. But let's say Gahoon, or, you know, Ashara. You know, one of the really key bosses that you definitely want to be doing the progress on, because that's what you mythic raid for. That's obviously going to bring the benefit down, because then I'm not getting the same rewards from mythic raiding. So those are the sorts of things that could tip it over the edge. And it might be that I decide, because at the moment there's a lot of unknowns about it, but I may come to the conclusion that what I fear is inevitable, at which point that'll be the decision. But I may equally take the decision that I'm just going to see how it plays out, and we'll see how it plays out. So I don't know. But I haven't made this. If I'd made a decision now, I would say so. Because although I like to think that I try and think about decisions, as soon as I've made a decision, I've made it. I action it straight away. So there we go. That's trying to hopefully explain that. Right, we have another dictionary corner. Now, I need to just... hopefully you'll be able to hear this. But... where is it? There it is. And there's the actual dictionary corner thing. So this was an interesting one. I've come across a couple of things like this. It says, I swear the word cash, every person says it differently. Like he says cash, meaning me, which is how it's pronounced in Britain. You pronounce it cash. I've never heard of that, but others say cachet. I think the cachet is, I think mostly Americans I've heard say cachet, because you do tend to have for some reason, I don't know why, do a Frenchy thing. It's like herbs. You say herbs instead of herbs. Now, people in Britain, or particularly England, often say herbs as well, but not because we're trying to be French, but because we drop H's. So, for example, instead of saying house, we often say house. It's very common, as I say, particularly in England, but you see it or hear it, I should say, in other parts of the UK sometimes as well, where people drop H's. But in America, you actually pronounce it herbs, which is strange, I find, because America tends to be the one that says, look, we've changed the spelling of things to be more efficient so that we're actually saying words as they're spelt, which is fine. So, for example, you spell through, I think, THRU, whereas we spell it THROUGH, which sounds strange. There's a reason, largely historical, but, if you're redoing your language, you think, well, let's just tidy up the spellings of these things. That makes sense. It sort of seems to fly out the window then when you have a word that's spelt herbs and you pronounce it herbs. So I've not quite got that. And it's the same thing here, I think, because in English, it doesn't even have the accent on it. In French, of course, it would have the accent on it, so it would pronounce cachet. That's how it would be literally spelled. But we don't. So, in fact, if I click on with the old Oxford, because I had another dictionary one this week, the old Oxford English Dictionary, hopefully you can hear this.
Cash.
So, maybe you didn't. But, I'll show you it as well in the Oxford English Dictionary. So it is, in Britain, pronounced cash. Now, there are things, I've said this before, because I had another one this week, which I almost put on the Idiot's Corner, but I decided he was too desperate a character, basically, because... It's the usual thing, I think. See, I understand people who are not from the UK but speak English as their first language don't always understand multiple pronunciations for things. You have, like in America, Canada, Australia, different accents, of course, but often pronunciations tend to be very, very similar, all the way north to New York to all the way south to Florida. Whereas in Britain, you only have to go 20, 30 miles before some words will be pronounced differently. And that's just because the language developed pre-industrial revolution when there was no, 2 places 30 miles apart, bloody, the other end of the world. There was no reason for most people to go there even. So travellers would have been few and far between. The roads weren't that great. This was before railways. So, and that's how it develops. But whereas in a country that develops post-industrial revolution, then it would be a different thing. It would be much more common. In fact, there's even an app you can get in the UK where it goes through common words and it gives you like 6 different pronunciations of them. Because there's, for some words, there's easily 6 or more different pronunciations. And by giving you like about a dozen of these different words and say how you pronounce it, it tries to pinpoint where you're from. It's not always work, because sometimes your pronunciation isn't entirely down to where you're from, because if you've got a parent that's from like other end of the country, part of your pronunciation, like my dad was from where I'm from, Doncaster. But my mum was from the Lake District, other end of the country. So some of that would have naturally come in as well. So yes. But yeah, I left him alone in the end, because at some point, when you sort of try, first of all, you try and explain to some people that, you know, did people in different parts of the world pronounce words differently? And that doesn't quite satisfy them. And you say, well, here's the Oxford English Dictionary. This is like the gold standard. That's like, I think in America you have Webster's. In Britain we have the Oxford English Dictionary. And that is like the standard. And you show them that and they're still not impressed. And then they try saying something like, well, the word isn't even, because it was shaman. And they were trying to say shaman, which is fine, but it's shaman where I come from. And they were trying to say, the word isn't even English. And I'm thinking, well, virtually no word is really English, because we're a Mongol language that took our words from everywhere else. But by saying that because it's not of English origin that we should pronounce it like someone else did, is a bit like saying that the person who first came up with the word determines exactly how it's pronounced by everyone. And the issue with that I would have is, okay, so who was the first person that came up with that word? Was anyone around to record exactly how they pronounced it? Because I'm pretty sure the tape recorder wasn't around at that point. Edison hadn't done his thing with his wax wheels either. So I'm not really convinced that you even know how the first word was ever pronounced. But anyway, there we go, moaning over. If some people, because some people did note, by the way, we should leave this thing alone, things like this. Things like this I don't leave alone, and there is a reason for it, which I'll try and explain to you. I'll just get rid of all this. I will try and explain to you. Part of it is just that I like arguing. But actually, you know, after 20 odd years on the internet, I have learnt to leave a lot of things alone. You know, you just learn to mellow out. As we get older, you mellow out anyway, don't you? But there are some things I don't. Now, here's the reason. So, I got a degree in physics from the University of Manchester. And this was quite a prestigious university to be getting a degree in physics in. And there's a lot of people who graduated with me who went on to extremely high paid jobs. But I didn't. I wanted to be a teacher. So, you know, and in this country, I know some countries it's different. In this country, teachers, I don't complain about the pay, especially in the north of England. It's not bad. It's above the national average, but it's not. It's basically a third of what I would have been earning if I'd have gone off and done one of the careers that I would have done otherwise. So basically, the way I look at it is I am hundreds of thousands of pounds down because I chose a vocation as opposed to some way of just making money and being bored stupid for 50 years of my life. And there was a reason I took up teaching, to dispel ignorance. So when people are, everyone's ignorant, I'm ignorant. Like the person said there, they pronounce it cache. Well, I've never heard of that. So there's some ignorance on my part. But it's willful ignorance. It's like, you know, someone doesn't understand something. Oh, I see why you don't understand. Maybe you're from a part of the world where pronunciations, you can travel 200 miles and never come across someone who pronounces that word differently. I get that. But here's another culture. Here's a thing. You know, it's not just me saying it, you know, but I mean, why would I pronounce a word differently anyway? You pronounce words in the way that you mimic anyway. So the fact that I pronounce it one way means that other people must have pronounced it that way as well, because I mimicked them. That's how I learnt the word in the first place. But anyway, you show them a document. You show Oxford English Dictionary. It's not like, you know, it's not just a dictionary I wrote. It's not in my handwriting. This is the gold standard. And they still don't buy that. And you just think, no, this is willful ignorance. And willful ignorance, in my opinion, is like the greatest sin in life. There is nothing worse than willful ignorance. Because all the most heinous crimes in reality, in the whole of history, could not have happened were it not for the willful ignorance of the population that allowed it, in my view. But anyway, that's that nonsense over with. But just to explain where I come from on that. So there is no leave it alone, he's not worth it when it comes to things like this with me. So I hope you enjoyed the mailbox. Anyway, what's next? So Azeroth review on Tuesday. So I will be randomising the winners for the competition then. So at least watch the first few minutes of it if you're going to watch it after it's gone live, if you are in that competition. And until next time, I'll see you later.